We've only screened this film at a couple of film festivals. I've only been at a couple of screenings. We've never screened it in California. It's about to come out, and this is the beginning of it all, but to have a crowd like this tonight is incredible. I have so many old friends here, too. I used to live in the Bay Area, and I was just saying, I often mix my films at Skywalker, but Paul said, would you mind mixing at Abbey Road? And so, okay, yeah, I think I can do that. So we mixed it at Abbey Road, which was incredible, and, we were able to get into all the tapes of everything, and we spent a lot of time on the mix too. So being able to see this film on a big screen, mixed as it was intended to be heard, and seen as it was intended to be seen. So I'm just so happy you can share in this. Afterwards, I'll be back to answer some questions, and please enjoy. Thanks.
I cried at the end.
Oh my God.
I cried at the end. So I think I want to start by saying, you and I are a different generation. So by 1971, I'd already seen the Beatles twice. So I'm wondering, where in your life, how old were you? Where in your life and your career did you find, were the Beatles a thing for you?
I was 0 years old. My dad was a Beatles fanatic. He saw the Beatles. We had a jukebox in our house growing up full of Beatles 45s.
Yeah.
I don't remember a time when the Beatles weren't in my life. And I really was obsessed with the Beatles. I went to my first Beatles fest when I was 12. I have made a lot of films about music, but my entire life I just said, am I ever going to touch anything about the Beatles? And when I got the call about this project, it just felt like, oh, I've been preparing for this my entire life. I am ready.
I think that Paul McCartney is probably one of the most documented performers. But your film touches on a period of his life where he was unsure of himself, reimagining himself, reinventing himself. Was there something that surprised you?
Well, there were a couple of things in the beginning. One is, the fact that Paul McCartney is a musical genius is not surprising. And in a way, I almost wanted to put that on the side and say, this is not a film about what a genius Paul McCartney is. It's a film about a person going through a crisis, an early midlife crisis at 27, trying to figure out who he is in the wake of coming out of this experience that's all he's ever known in his life. And when that disappears overnight, he has to figure out, who am I as an artist, as a person, now as a father and husband? All that happened in that 1 year, 1969. He marries Linda, he has Mary. John says he wants a divorce from the band, and everything just disappears. And in a way, watching the Get Back documentary that Peter Jackson did, in my head, I always thought, I want this film to kind of start the next day. You see Paul in Get Back, and you see how much he's trying to keep it together, and he's pushing, and songs are just pouring out of him. And then the question is, what happens when that just suddenly disappears? And I think Paul was heartbroken. I think everybody was heartbroken. I think the public was heartbroken. I think critics were upset. And I think a lot of the attitude Paul got, and frankly all four of them got, was, why can't you guys just get back together? What are you doing? Please, can we just have the Beatles back? And I think part of Paul felt that way. And I've talked to Paul about this. I think the Get Back project allowed Paul to maybe say, maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought, because Let It Be, which was kind of the initial telling, the film of that album, is really a divorce film, and it's all the negative stuff. But if you watch Get Back, you realize there's love and there's humor and friction and all of these things. It's complicated. They're brothers who are just kind of sick of each other. but they love each other, there's no doubt. And I think Paul, coming out of that experience, thought, well, maybe it wasn't as bad as everybody's told me and as I've internalized it. And this next period had also been quite painful. He had to sue them, and so many things were tough for him in that period. But I think he thought maybe there's still something to be learned from it. Maybe it wasn't that bad. So in a way, I think Paul is still, I know he is still processing this. And the film is part of that. We get to enjoy it, but it's also a very expensive form of therapy, I guess, for him to talk about this. But part of what I had to know in the beginning was, is Paul going to go there? And can I really talk to him about it? And Paul's probably been interviewed more than most people on the planet. And Paul, like most people, like everybody, kind of has a jukebox of anecdotes in his head when you ask him about something. Tell me about this album, and he'll tell you the story, which we all kind of do. Rather than actually thinking about it, we just kind of tell the story we always tell. And so I really started from the beginning to say, okay, I want to talk at a 10,000 foot level, and I want to talk at a 1 inch level. So I would come in to start the interviews, and we talk about painting. We talk about kids, and I just kind of acted like I have all the time in the world, but let's just have an engaging conversation. And Paul was really enjoying it. And then the 1 inch level questions were, when you're playing the bass line on Silly Love Songs, how do you sing the melody on top of that? Because that is such a difficult thing to sing on top of what you're playing. And then, that's fun to talk about and geek out on that stuff and start to really think about these things. And once we got this rapport going, he just kept opening up and started to really enjoy it. And, I did many interviews with him over probably a year. So I went to London multiple times and New York and LA, and I would visit him, and, I was the documentary shrink showing up.
So jealous.
I mean, as I will say, the first interview I did, I met him several times before that, but the first time we were recording, it was in his office in London, and he has a studio downstairs, and his studio engineer set up microphones. They said, they had set up microphones for you in Paul's office, because we were just doing audio. And there was this tiny love seat in his office, and the microphones are there, and basically I'm like sitting here, and Paul comes in, and he's 6 inches from my face, and he starts eating some hummus, and he's like hanging out, and we start talking about John Lennon, and it's like somebody from the Bible telling you stories about, something that happened, millennia ago. So it took me about 15 minutes to be like, I have to put that side of my brain, the fan side of my brain, away, and that I can't see that side of my brain until this film is done. I just have to do that. And Paul, I have to say, is expert at making you forget he's Paul. He's had to deal with it for 65 years. So that he made it easier for me to do that. But then, the film, I know, because I've just, since he saw the film, I think has really changed his thinking about some of these things, and I was telling you at dinner, he had a family screening, and he invited me and my family to go, and it was all of his cousins and his uncles and the kids and the grandkids and everybody, and it was just this kind of magical night, and the grandkids were all sitting in front of me, and they don't know any of this. So one of the grandkids says, I've never heard my grandmother's voice before, Linda's voice. I know. And then one of the other grandkids said, Grandpa went to jail? But in a way, I feel like my job is sometimes holding up a mirror to people, and in that way, the fact that Paul wanted to share that with his whole family said something about what I think I tried to capture.
And I feel like I misunderstood her in a lot of ways. She really was like the emotional anchor. She was really the heart of the whole thing, and it just felt like a family. More than just like a band, but like a family.
Well, those things were inseparable. When they're on the road, the kids went on every tour he ever did. Every show, there was no separation. I don't say it in the film, but many people have heard that Paul and Linda never spent a night apart from the day they were married, except for the 9 days he spent in jail in Japan. That they were inseparable. And there was the family was the center of everything. And if the music could work around that, great, but the family was always the center. And the fact that Paul chose Linda, Linda chose Paul, but Paul was the world's most eligible bachelor. There were a lot of people, maybe you, who would want to marry him.
Dreams don't always come true.
And he meets Linda. She's a rock photographer. She's a divorcee with a 5-year-old daughter.
But very grounded.
But that's the thing. She had lived life. Wasn't just starry-eyed, oh, Paul, you're the cute one. It was, here's somebody who's lived life, who understands how the world works. She'd also come from, her dad, Lee Eastman, was a music industry lawyer. She was not part of the Eastman Kodak family, which many people still think to this day. But her dad was a successful lawyer so she knew the music industry and the entertainment industry. She'd grown up around some parts of that. But she's the one who constantly both created a buffer and gave Paul permission. Paul told me just recently that when he would present these ideas to her, the thing she would always say is, it's allowed, Paul. Just this sense of permission to kind of not second guess his own creative instincts. And he said after watching the film, looking back on it, some of those ideas were pretty crazy. He described it as, I felt like it was very madcap, whether it was, releasing Mary Had a Little Lamb or van tours or cartoons and there were many more things he was doing, but it was all him just experiencing the freedom of being able to do whatever he wants and not having to answer to anybody at that point.
I would imagine that Wings was actually more fulfilling in many ways than being with the Beatles. Maybe not?
I don't know. Wings is, I think he just thinks of Wings as just a chapter of his life. Like, it's the fact that Wings never became a real entity of 4 or 5 individuals, that it became a little bit of a revolving door. I think was part of the thing that, Paul had wanted this idea of, all I know is how to take a band and start from nothing and build it up. That's what we did with the Beatles. That's what I want to do with Wings. And literally, the first album they do, Wildlife, he's like, well, let's just do it in 2 weeks and we don't have to overthink it. And they do the van tour and very purposefully keep it smaller, grows small theaters to bigger theaters, and just really didn't want it to get ahead of itself. But the fact is, he was still Paul McCartney. He kept trying to pretend that or hoping the world would forget that fact, but they wouldn't. And so I think part of what this story is him coming to terms with the fact that he is who he is. He can't just be one of the guys. It can't ever just be a band called Wings. The first Wings album is just released under the name Wings, and then later it becomes Paul McCartney and Wings. But he's trying in the beginning to just disappear a little bit, and it's impossible. It's part of why I called the film Man on the Run is my image I had in my head was just him trying to escape the shadow of the Beatles, which was a totally impossible goal. There was no way that was ever going to happen, but that was constantly what he was trying, not playing Beatles songs early on, trying to write songs that he thought didn't sound like Beatles songs, and it was something all of them had to deal with, but something I think Paul was really kind of haunted by.